This is the last of the 3 different videos, or lectures for World War II. So now we're gonna talk a little bit about, the battles, and this is briefly. So, anyone that's looking for a ton of military history, that's not really what I'm gonna do right now. I'm just gonna briefly kind of, like, go over, like, how the war progressed between 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and from when they surrendered in August of 1945. And then the effects of that too, and how the Allied powers came together and tried to kind of plan for a peace once it was reached between Germany, Italy, and Japan. So the first thing we need to do, just kind of review from world history, are the two theaters of operation. That's how they're referred to. If you think about them as like, battlefronts, military historians, they call them these theaters of operation. So the first one is going to be the Pacific Theater, and this is fighting the Japanese. They're going to reach the height of their power in 1942. That will come to an end after the Battle of Midway. They occupied islands throughout the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines in particular. The United States had to evacuate the Philippines not long after Pearl Harbor. So by May of 1942, we evacuated the Philippines, our military, just because we didn't have the support right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And then and in Europe, that's going to be the first focus, right? So a Europe first strategy. That's most of the fighting towards the beginning of the war was between the Germans and the Soviets. Their height of advancement was in 1942, and then the Soviet victory of Stalingrad, if you want to call it that, in February of 1943. So, early in 1942, what are the objectives, especially between the British and the United States? What are they wanting to accomplish? The first thing is that they need to overcome the use of German submarines within the Atlantic. They had attacked and sank over 500 Allied ships. It got better with the use of radar and sonar technologies. The other thing are bombing raids. So they are two different types. The first one is strategic bombing. This is going to be carried out by day, and so think of it this way: during the day, you have better um, sites for it to be strategic, and you know exactly what it is that you're hitting. And they're raiding military targets in Germany, and they were civilian and military to a certain extent. Eventually, they will turn to saturation bombing. That will take place at night, and it's just um, drop as many bombs as you can. Doesn't really matter where they hit. A lot of civilian lives are lost then, but it was kind of more about morale at that point. Um, so they're doing that in Europe, but they have to get there, right? They have to get troops in Europe because Germany holds that natural border with the English Channel. And that's a difficult thing to do. So if you remember any type of when we've talked about wars in the past, the most difficult job is being the invader. So think of that with like the Civil War and how the Union had to invade the South in order to defeat the rebels. The Allied powers have to infiltrate Europe in order to defeat Hitler. So they start in Africa. They needed kind of like a footing. The Germans had taken control um, of Africa, and so Operation Torch was led by a young U.S. General, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He will later become president, and they had taken control by May of 1943. So you're looking at a little over a year after, like a year and a half after Pearl Harbor. That's where the number one focus is, and that, again, that was difficult too. Then I want you to kind of like picture, like in your head, the map of Europe and Africa. So from that point, they're going to use that footing in Africa, the north coast of Africa, and they're going to attack Sicily. right? And then from Sicily up the Italian peninsula. And they had achieved that fairly quickly by the summer of 1943. Now, Mussolini ends up escaping. Germans were able to maintain control over northern Italy, mostly because of the mountain ranges. Um, um, and that they'll finally surrender that in May of 1945. Now, looking at France, D-Day is probably one of the most important dates in American history that you should know, which is June 6th. It was a major turning point in the war. And notice that it was 1944. There was a ton of planning here. It was called Operation Overlord. Eisenhower is in charge of the Allied powers, so British, Canadian, and US forces. And they successfully secured the beaches of Normandy, France, along that coastline. So 156,000 Allied troops, 73,000 were US troops. They landed on Omaha and Utah beaches. So those were kind of like the code names as they're planning all of this out. Operation Overlord, if you look at it like how on paper this is what they were supposed to do, and then when you actually read more and find out about like what actually happened, it was not very successful. Just about everything that could have gone wrong went wrong with this invasion, except for the fact that we were able to secure that footing and able to stay, if that makes any sense. Like we were able to make it, but we lost a lot of men. So there were multiple. And when you look at the casualties alone, remember that a casualty is anyone that's injured to the point where they can no longer be of use, like as like a infantry or sailor or whatever it might be. So 2,500 men died that day, or of their injuries. 6,000 casualties. A lot of people were missing in action. The numbers I kind of see a range. This is the number that your AMSCO book gives. A lot of men drowned, um, and just were never found. Um, so this was a combination of, so it's an amphibious landing, right? In addition to Army pilots, so there's no US Air Force at this point in time. You could either be an Army pilot or a Navy pilot. But you were kind of enlisted in one or the other. So there were 15,000 US airborne troops in addition to that. There's an excellent series. So there's a movie that I always show a clip of. It's called Saving Private Ryan, and the first 30 minutes of the film is D-Day, and it's Army Rangers. It's based on a true story. It's an excellent film. There's another really good series called Band of Brothers that HBO did about the 101st Airborne that were also at D-Day, and kind of showing like a different view. So on this next slide, I'll kind of show you what was happening. So you have simultaneously on the morning of June 6th, Americans, Canadians, and Brits are coming in on boats. The weather was really bad, and so that was one of the things that kind of went wrong. Eisenhower was like, he had to decide, are we going to do this? And the weather affect how successful it could be. If we postpone it, maybe the Germans will get wind of it. And so he decided to stick with it. Now, some of you might have heard about how they had like kind of like this decoy type situation that they tried to kind of like infiltrate with the Germans, where they were giving them kind of like false information, like they were letting certain codes get taken, and what they were basically saying is that there was going to be an American invasion, but it was going to be in a different location. And what they actually even did was they created these like fake, like imagine like almost like inflatable tanks and things like that. And like Patton was in on it, and like Patton was in a different part of England, and it looked as if, so when Germany's flying over England, it looks as if they are mobilizing to leave this certain part of England, which I can't show you here, to hit like northern France. And they fell for it apparently. So, well, Hitler fell for it apparently. He, even though some of his advisors were like, oh, I don't know, like this could be a little fishy. Like we really shouldn't move a lot of our troops in that direction, we should still keep them kind of spread out. Like we have a good defense right here. Hitler apparently said no, like Patton's their main guy. Patton, if you don't know, was an esteemed tank commander who was very successful in Africa and Italy and will be in Europe as well. And he was like, no, like this is it. If Patton's there and Patton's men are there, then this is going to be the real deal. And so it did help the fact that there were fewer German soldiers in Normandy than what would have normally happened been there. So here are a few images. Now this photograph up in the top left-hand corner, this is after we have secured the beaches and secured a certain number of, I'm not sure how many miles, right, of territory. And so this is when like we are unloading the full might of the Allied powers into France to liberate. This in the top right-hand corner is a photograph of young men coming into Normandy. This is a particular type of boat that was designed for this. And in fact, there's a museum in New Orleans, a World War II museum in New Orleans, which you're like, oh, that's kind of a random place. But the guy that designed this boat, and of course, I didn't look it up before I started talking, so I apologize. He is from New Orleans, and so that's why they have. And apparently, it's just like been ranked one of the best museums in the country in the last couple of years. These in the bottom left, these were left on the beaches. So the Germans put those there in order to be a deterrent for like bringing in ships and unloading things. And a lot of men hid under those as they were taking on enemy fire on D-Day. And this is today, this is where men that died in Europe and on D-Day are buried. So there is a cemetery in Normandy where Americans are buried. And in fact, on this land, like it's American, like taxpayer money goes to maintain this cemetery, rightfully so. It's like it's actually kind of considered like, American soil. Not that you could, like, if you got in trouble with the French police, you could go there and like, it's not like it's sovereign or anything, but they're the ones that kind of pay for it. So by August of 1944, so not long, Paris is liberated. By September, the Allied powers are moving into Germany, across the German border. Now, by December, there is a major counterattack. It's called the Battle of the Bulge, and the reason it's called that is because it created a bulge in the front line here. So imagine that the United States or the Allied powers are moving east across. So here's Belgium. They're moving east across Germany or towards Germany. And during this winter, so it's basically a few weeks of this really bad weather, like constant snow, blizzard conditions. And it was so bad that the Allied powers could not use their planes to bring them in for support, because that was something that had been saving the Allied powers why they were able to kind of move through France so quickly and through Belgium, is because of air support. So basically how it would work is they would go in, they would shoot some stuff up, right? And then they would bring in their men. So when they couldn't do that, German counterattack, and that's what you would kind of need to know, right, is this German counterattack pushed them back to where, and it lasted for about a month. So by January, the weather clears and they're able to use their air support. Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, there was a battle there that was high casualties. And so anyways, that was kind of the only like real resistance to the Allied powers as they're advancing towards Berlin. So by April, the Russians are closing in. So the Soviets, if you think about it, one of the reasons that the Soviets lost as many people as they did, and I'm going to recommend that you watch this video. In fact, we might do that during our Zoom meeting. There's a video where it looks at the amount of Soviet deaths, and that's because once Germany had secured all the way up to the English Channel, and once they've secured it, that means that they could concentrate most of their soldiers on fighting the Soviets. And so that's why you saw such huge deaths between the Germans and the Soviets were the invader. Now, once they had to spread those lines between the British and the Americans on the west, and then the Soviets on the east, that's when everything kind of happens a little bit quicker, and you're able to kind of make some actual moves. And so, as the Soviets are moving in, by April, Hitler and most of his advisors commit suicide. So, an unconditional surrender happens May 7th, and then that and May 7th is considered Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. US troops are going to advance through Germany, and they're liberating concentration camps. Now, this is happening before May. The Soviets had already started to find these camps. You remember from world history the horror of this genocide. Um, Most were Jewish civilians, in addition to Poles and gypsies, homosexuals, people with physical, mental disabilities, anyone that was deemed to be undesirable. So they were either in work camps or in actual death camps where they were murdered by um, most by gas. In other cases, like especially towards the end, um, they were shot and killed, or left to starve to death. So once that's so as that's happening in Europe, so I'm teaching this thematically. That is the war in Europe. That is that European theater. At the same time, you have some fighting taking place with our Navy and the Pacific Theater. Um, and this is mostly the United States in the Pacific Theater, right? Because our enemy is Japan, and what they did on Pearl Harbor. So General Douglas MacArthur, he was stationed in the Philippines. He is going to be the commander of the Southern Pacific, and so he is again evacuates the Philippines in early 1942, March. By June of 1942, though, you have the Battle of Midway. So Japan targets Midway. Midway is one of those places that we um, took over during that imperialism period of time. And so, an important American naval base. And so, the United States, we concentrate what forces we have left at Midway, and we defeat the Japanese there. And so, from that point on, the Japanese are not expanding, they're not moving across the Pacific and taking other major islands. We kind of halt that expansion or advancement. But then we kind of like settle for a little bit. There are no major battles for a while. And the strategy that they used in the Pacific for the remainder of the war was called island hopping. And so basically, instead of just like trying to move, like gain all of these islands, it was more about strategizing which ones do we need. So ones that had a ton of Japanese, the ones that were strongly held, we would kind of like isolate them. We would take other little islands so that we could kind of isolate those and then concentrate our naval power and our air power to bomb them. So you can kind of see how they kind of skip along, and they'll skip little islands that they're really not all that worried about. And the goal eventually is, so we'll get to the Philippines. Eventually, the goal is going to be mainland Japan. So fast forward to October of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was the largest naval battle, a lot of people say, like, in history. Like over 200,000 naval personnel participated in this battle. And the result was that the Japanese Navy was pretty much crippled. One of the things I forgot to mention earlier was the fact that Pearl Harbor probably could have been, excuse me, it could have been a lot worse. One of the things that saved us from like having to completely rebuild was the fact that it just so happened that all of our aircraft carriers were out to training that day. So when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and they get our battleships and our cruisers and our destroyers and things like that, the one thing that they didn't get were aircraft carriers, which are the most important part of a naval fleet. All the other ships are designed to like flank and protect, and I mean, obviously they have more jobs than that, but I probably am not doing a very good job explaining if there are any naval historians out there. But Um, for sure, because we had our aircraft carriers, that helped a ton because all of the people back at home, right, they're turning out all of the battleships in order to kind of protect those aircraft carriers. So um, this is the first battle. A lot of kids always think that the Japanese, like on Pearl Harbor, are kamikaze pilots, like just like driving their planes into places, and that's not true. Um, and this is important in understanding how once we get to the bomb, is that a part of Japanese culture, the warrior culture, within their modern military, it was about honor and duty. And even today in the Japanese culture, for men especially, honor is very important. If you bring dishonor to your family, I think suicide rate is something crazy among men in Japanese culture. Um, and the idea is that if you bring dishonor, right, that you need to end your life. And for sure back at this point in time. And so the thing was, and when you think about kamikaze, it wasn't just like being reckless and like, hey, I'm going to take off in my plane and go crash it into something. It was more about the fact that if you knew that your plane was going down, right, they were instructed to use the plane to create as much damage as possible, which doesn't really seem all that crazy if you know that you're gonna. Well, I guess you could always, eject and survive the crash, but regardless, that's not how they viewed it, right? Like you're gonna die with honor. A lot of Americans did this as well, by the way. If they knew that they were going down, they would try to use their crash to, at least and have some sort of damage. But they are using their planes to damage U.S. ships. And you could use that as evidence, like if you're going to talk about the use of the bomb a little bit later. So Iwo Jima is another really important to the United States. Um, they are. It's a very difficult battle for this one. The United States Marines. Oh, so this photograph in the top right hand corner, you've probably seen it before. There's a memorial to the United States Marine Corps in Washington, D.C., where it is a statue of this. It's beautiful. Um, and Iwo Jima was a very difficult battle. So there were 23,000 Japanese. I think there were like 5,000 Marines, and they were able to defeat the Japanese. Okinawa is the largest island, like it's the next closest thing to Japan, so about 300 miles. This battle had the largest casualties in the Pacific theater, over 100,000 Japanese, 50,000 US casualties. Now, while all that is happening, because of the Office of Research and Development, you have the Manhattan Project being developed. The lead physicist is Robert Oppenheimer. Over 100,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project. Like the majority of them did not know that that's what they were working on. They thought that they were working on other little projects. They were kind of like, putting it all together. And then, only, your top people exactly knew what was going on. It was top secret. $2 billion to develop the weapon, with between R&D, so research and development, and the actual like engineering of it. And so what an atomic bomb is it takes the energy from splitting an atom, so nuclear fission, and they successfully tested the first bomb on July 16th. So notice that date, July 16th, 1945. So in less than a month, they are going to use this bomb twice on populated areas, which is it's kind of a crazy idea. Like, how much testing can you really? And there was that one bomb before they used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So after Okinawa, when you looked at the deaths, and by this point, FDR has passed away. He dies in March of 1945. Um, Truman knew nothing about the Manhattan Project as vice president. So when he comes in, it's basically a lot of advisors are coming at him. They're saying, FDR knew about it. Like he was tempted to use it if we could figure it out. And so a lot of advisors believed that if we tried to use our military to invade Japan, it could result in heavy casualties, and they're talking about millions of people. Not only Japanese civilians and Japanese soldiers, but they're talking about at least 1 million American men could die just because of that Japanese honor as a part of their culture. And so Truman and the Allies call for Japan to surrender. So this unconditional surrender. And that's important to understand because an unconditional surrender basically means that once you surrender, we're in charge. And like even today, we are the Japanese military. Now they have their own like sovereign government, but there are certain things that they rights that they lost after after they surrendered in 1945. And even when you look at like Germany today, we helped rebuild the German government. And so that's why, I mean, the number of military bases that we have in Germany, I couldn't even tell you. So he gives them basically an ultimatum: unconditional surrender or face utter destruction. And so the thing is they need to figure out where to bomb. And I came across this a couple years ago. It is kind of crazy, so I added it into my PowerPoint because I think that it's interesting. So how did they pick Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Not like huge major cities. They were pretty heavily populated, but they brought in a group of people, mathematicians, theoretical physicists. They looked at like blast effects of bombs. They brought in weather consultants because the weather played a really important role. I had read that they were originally going to go with a different city, but the date in which they wanted to do it, it was supposed to be cloudy. Like there was supposed to be some like light weather over that city that day. And so that's why that city did not get chosen. That's why Hiroshima did, which is insane to think about. So some of the most important considerations were, and I just picked some highlights here that kind of surprised me the most. When they selected these targets, they wanted to obviously have the greatest military effect on the Japanese people, first and foremost. That kind of makes sense, right? Let's effectively shorten the war. If we're trying to avoid loss of life, like let's get this over with. And the second thing was the morale effect. So think of like Sherman's march to the sea, right? Like the Japanese morale needs to be destroyed in addition to this. So that is going to lead to the following things. For damage, when you're looking at damage, you have the primary blast, but then you have fires that the explosion is going to create. So they wanted to pick targets that had a large percentage of closely built like wood frame buildings. And so both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a little bit older cities, densely populated. That's one of the other things. The maximum blast effect was about 1 mile in radius. So they wanted it to be densely populated, or at least the buildings to be densely like close together. The other thing is these were two like factory towns, like so there were factories that were producing things for the Japanese war, so that's their military strategic value. And then Hiroshima, the reason that was selected to go first, and that's why Nagasaki, like in that other city that I was talking about. So there were like two different contenders for the first target because the first target had to be relatively untouched by any type of previous bombing by the Americans. They wanted to be able to see the effect of one single atomic bomb. So if it had been attacked in some way beforehand, then they wouldn't really have the data that they were looking for. They wanted to see what an untouched city, what type of damage an atomic bomb could do on an untouched city. And so that's why Hiroshima was selected, and because the weather was nice that day. So on August 6th, 1945, they dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. That is a photograph to the left of the aftermath within the first couple of weeks after the atomic bomb was dropped. They waited for a surrender for 3 days, and it didn't come, and so they dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th. Over 250,000 Japanese either died immediately or from prolonged illnesses, such as like cancer and leukemia, radiation poisoning, burns, infection. My grandfather was in the Navy. He was on the USS Montpelier in the Pacific towards the end of the war. And his ship actually pulled into Nagasaki in late August, early September, is what I was told. And they didn't like get out and like obviously walk around. There's nothing there, but he told my dad that he could smell the city from like, 40 miles, 50 miles away, just like the burn and the death and like just the smell of death is how he kind of described it. So, days later, August 15th, Victory in Japan Day, VJ Day. September 2nd is when the Japanese surrendered to MacArthur, and that is the official formal surrender. It was an unconditional surrender. So, wartime conferences. This is where they are trying to kind of plan out the end. So you have the big three. You have Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. They're going to meet multiple times. The first one is going to be in Casablanca, January of 1943. This is where FDR and Churchill basically kind of talk about their game plan of how they're going to liberate France and provide that second front for Stalin. Then again, in November, they meet in Tehran. Um, they talked about how they're going to liberate France. The Soviets are going to also invade Germany, and they basically promised to eventually invade Japan or help the United States defeat Japan. They will declare war on Japan very late in the game. I'll get to that in a second. Now, when we're looking at tension, so remember that Stalin, this is the Soviet Union, they're communists. A lot of Americans, this was not an alliance because like they were good people. This was an alliance because we had a common enemy. And so there wasn't a lot of trust there. In fact, a lot of the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular kept making comments about that FDR and Churchill were dragging their feet on creating that second front because the United States and Britain wanted the Soviets to lose a bunch of people and spend a bunch of money and weaken the Soviet Union. So that's going to add to some Cold War tension later. Um, in Yalta, February of 1945, this is the most historic because this is where they basically agree that Germany, after the defeat, would be divided up into 4 different occupational zones, or not at this point, I'm sorry, it's not going to be 4, but it's going to be divided into different occupied zones of the Allied powers, and that there would be free elections in these liberated countries. The problem is that the Soviet Union will obviously back out on that during the Cold War. The Soviets would declare war on Japan, and again, they didn't do that until August 8th. Remember, the first bomb was dropped August 6th, the second bomb August 9th, and they declared war on August 8th. So a little late to the game. And that they would create a new world peace organization, so the United Nations, which is still around today. So it was kind of an attempt to another shot at the League of Nations. Now, when you look at this photograph to the right, you can see how different FDR looks, kind of a little emaciated, a little sick. He will die within a month after returning back from Yalta. And so at that point, Truman is president in July of 1945. So again, so Germany has fallen. Japan is still holding strong. Stalin's the only one remaining because Churchill loses re-election. So Prime Minister Attlee is there at that conference. And this is where they basically agree that Japan needs to have an unconditional surrender, and also that Nazi leaders are going to be charged on war crimes. So they held counsel for that. So effects, when you look at the deaths, they're as high as 80 million. We'll never know. And you'll see in the video that I'm going to show you guys, you know, did the Soviet Union really know how many people were dead, especially with the civilians that were killed in all of this? Do we know how many people were executed during the Holocaust and that genocide? When you're looking at, you have the famine that took place, numbers range from 38 to 55 million. Military dead, about 25 million, including 5 million prisoners of war. 15 million Americans served in uniform, and over 300,000 died in Europe, between Europe and the Pacific. 800,000 were wounded and came back home to a very different life. So if you take out the Civil War, because right, that's Americans fighting Americans, more Americans died in World War II than all the other wars combined, and this is a modern war too. If you think about it's within the 20th century. In addition to that, you have a huge national debt, but as you're going to see in the video that I'm going to show you, we're much better off than other nations. And so that brings the war to an end. And after this, there are going to be two major countries that kind of rise to power, and that's going to create the Cold War. You have the United States and the Soviet Union, and this competition for spreading democracy versus spreading communism, and how the two clash, and how there is this new competition for gaining allies. And so you have the first world power, first world versus second world, in this clash for kind of like domination. So these two superpowers in the Cold War. And so that is the end of this video.